close.
I think I actually have a screenshot on my phone.
Just a moment. All right. I think everything is up and running the way it is supposed to. Let me just adjust things so I can see if any questions come through YouTube. I usually don't, but you never know. All right. It is 7:01. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and get down to work. We are beginning chapter 8, and if you have been leafing ahead or if you're reading this in a book rather than just online, you'll notice that we're getting close to the end, which means, as usual, I will take suggestions and recommendations before we move into our next Masechet. So please send those by email or any other normal means of communication so that I can review what our options are before we proceed. But let's see what we can do about chapter 8 today. Chapter 8 is basically dealing with delivery. Hello? I think we might have had audio problems on one of the...
I can hear you.
Chapter 8 is basically dealing with delivery. And as Rabbi Kolb's introduction explains very cogently, the delivery of a get, while in and of itself is not 100% required, that is to say, there are ways to accept a get delivery on behalf of a woman. The Torah itself says that it has to be put into her hand. And as such, the ideal form of a normal get delivery means it has to go to the wife, and it has to be done in a way that makes her cognizant, that makes her aware of what is actually happening, the divorce. So that's the underlying principle that's going to govern how we read this chapter. All right, so let's get down to the first text. If a husband throws a get to his wife and she is in her house or in her courtyard, she is divorced. So obviously, as I keep saying every time we talk about this, the best way is to walk up and say, hey, this is your get. I'm divorcing you, and put it in her hands. That is the appropriate statement. However, the law has to also cover when people are not following the rules. Does it count or does it not? So here, the husband has thrown it to her, so it comes into her possession, and she is standing in her house or her courtyard. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, Rabbi. I'm sure I learned somewhere that when a woman is married, according to the biblical and rabbinic statute, her property is temporarily her husband's to handle and to administrate. It doesn't exactly become his, but it is under his control. Whoop, there we go. Sorry, I think someone unmuted by mistake. And that would seem to imply that her house is his house. Not exactly, says the Talmud, for unpacking this. The idea is that this is her house, property that she owned before getting married, or her courtyard that she owned before getting married. And while married, her husband may have many rights to it. The moment that she is divorced, both she and the courtyard leave his domain. So, sorry, I'm not sure why this keeps unmuting. Okay, so the idea is that once she gets divorced, or rather simultaneous with her receipt of the get, the house reverts to be 100% her property. And that means that she is in her own domain, and thus it is perfectly fine, and she is divorced. Unlike the second sentence, if he throws it to her in his house or his courtyard, even though it is within her, with her on the same bed, meaning even that close, she is not divorced. Just getting it close to her when it's not her area is not sufficient, because technically that area belongs to him. It's no different than him transferring it from a shelf to his pocket. It is still in his domain. Even if the shelf is closer to her, that doesn't count as being given to her. It has to actually get to her. And since the area around her is not her property, it is not her domain, she's not in charge of it, that means that it doesn't become her possession. So that's the distinction between the first and second parts. Let me do line 3, and then we can take the question. If he throws it into her lap or into her basket, she is divorced. The rabbis understood that her own clothing or the basket from which she got her fabric or her spinning was considered to be enough of her domain that even if she was in his domain, that was still private enough, that was still owned enough by her and relinquished enough by him that that counts as being her turf. As such, if the get reaches that level, then even if she is in his place, it still counts as having been given to her, and thus she is divorced. Yes, Aaron, your question.
Yes, Rabbi. He still has to make the statements, I am divorcing you, even if he throws it to her, right?
Right, but the question is, I'm divorcing you, and then he drops it, would necessitate these principles. He's saying, here's your get, and then he throws it over his shoulder. Is she divorced or not? Well, it's going to depend upon where they are, and as we'll see, if they're outside of either of their domain later on, it'll also make a difference. Part 2, or rather Mishnah 2, is going to give us a different scenario where he is actually not telling her that it's her get, that it's getting to her, but not with the awareness that what she is receiving is the get. So let's move down there and take a look at that. If he said to her, take in this debt document, meaning he is lying and telling her that it is a different type of legal document, or if she found it behind him and read it and it turned out to be her get. The example that's given in the Talmud is that he actually has it on his back and he turns around and she takes it from his back. Then it is not a get until he says to her, here is your get. That there still needs to be the affirmation that this is a get, it is being given as a get. It has to be given with the awareness of the wife. She has to understand this is a get. Hopefully that's pretty clear. So now we have the two things. It has to be into her possession / domain, and it has to be done clearly with her knowledge that what she is receiving is a get. Part 3, or rather part 2, but paragraph 3 in this translation, if he put it into her hand while she was asleep, and when she woke up, she read it and found it was her get, it is not a get until he says to her, here is your get. Again, same principle. It's as in her possession as possible, literally in her hand, but she was asleep. Clearly, she was not aware of what she was receiving, and thus the get does not count as a get. It doesn't affect a divorce until he makes the proper declaration. And then part 4 is going to handle what happens when we're not in either person's domain. If she were standing in the public domain, a public street or marketplace, and he threw it to her, if it lands near her, she is divorced. But if it lands near him, she is not divorced. If it lands midway, she is divorced and not divorced. So the understanding from the Talmud is that we're talking about the usual domain of personal space of the Arba Amot, the 4 cubits, roughly 6 feet, that are around us. that if it lands within her 6 feet, then it counts as being hers as long as that is nearer to her within that zone. If they are face to face and that drops and it is 3 feet from her and 3 feet from him, then we end up with our tricky situation that we talked about before, where she is neither divorced, she is not fully divorced, and she is not fully still married. She is divorced and not divorced, at which point we're going to need a second get to resolve the situation. Questions, comments?
Yes, Rabbi. Without the second get, the stringencies, both stringencies apply, right?
Correct. All right. So far, I imagine this is fairly clear. The idea of the action with the declaration. This is very much in keeping with standard Jewish law practice. You can't just say the words. You can't just do the deed. It's got to go together, and it has to be done right. 8.3. Similarly with betrothals, and similarly with debt. Meaning, as long as we're talking about the delivery of important legal documents, let's talk about other important legal documents. In this case, we're talking about betrothals, when we're getting married or arranging to be married, or when a debt is being established between two people. If a man's creditor said to him, "Throw me my debt," and he threw it to him, if it lands nearer to the creditor, the borrower is credited with having paid back his debt. If it lands nearer to the borrower is still obligated to repay the money. If it lands midway, they divide. Unlike a divorce, which has to be one or the other, or else you get stuck in limbo, when it comes to a legal claim of who owns what or who owes what, there are ways to split the baby, to divide that amount. And again, of course, this should be a strong reminder that it's best to do it right in the first place.
Can you please repeat the idea? Sorry.
The idea,
and also, I couldn't start the video. I thought that you want us to see our faces and say that the host doesn't allow us to start the video. Just for information.
That is very strange. Let me see. Oh, yep, there it is. Yep, there we go. You should be able to do it now.
Okay, I started feeling like it's something personal. That you didn't want to see our faces of your students.
No, I changed one of the master settings for something else on Zoom, and I didn't remember that it was going to change other things too.
Oh, okay. So
okay. No, actually, I like being able to see human beings.
Yeah. If you can explain again the idea, yes, and also comparing with the get. Because when you explain the get, okay, I also was a little distracted. So, yes.
All right. So for any legal document delivery, there has to be an awareness of what is being delivered, and there needs to be the actual act of delivery. Now, usually that means somebody's going to, I don't have do I have a random piece of paper around? No, I don't. I keep my desk clean. I got a Post-it note. Usually that means, that disappears in there we go. Usually that means that you're going to hand it over into the waiting hand of the other person. That's the best. Here is the debt document. Thank you very much. I have it now. Or with a get, or with a betrothal, or anything. With regards to a get, if the husband throws it at the wife and it drops to the ground in between them, then we have to figure out, did it arrive to her, thus divorcing her, or did it stay with him, thus meaning they are not divorced? And if it lands in the middle, what do we do? The last Mishnah says, actually, I'll just roll that back up. The last Mishnah said that if it lands near enough to her, within the Arba Amot, the 6 feet circle around her in the public domain, then it counts as being hers, and she is divorced. If it lands near him, then it still is his, and they are not divorced. If it lands in between them, meaning at the exact in-between spot, so which would be about 3 feet between each of them, then like a meter and a meter, then she is stuck until we get a new get, because it is unclear whether she was or wasn't divorced, whether it was or wasn't in her possession. But when it comes time for a money document, not a divorce document, a debt document, we have the same rule. If it is closer to one, it got to the guy. If it is closer to the other, it got to him. But if it fell in the between, unlike with a divorce, we can actually split it in half. If it was supposed to be $1,000, well, now it's only going to be 500. We can deal with this like we would with any other monetary dispute, where if you can show grounds on both sides, but we can't establish who was correct, we just split it down the middle, splitting the baby, if you will, from the story of King Solomon. So that is the way that they reconcile that. Good. Okay. Now we get one more exceptional case. We're talking about left and right. Now we have to do up and down. If she was standing on a roof and he threw it up to her, as soon as it reaches the airspace of the roof, she is divorced, right? That area is considered in her zone. It gets up to her level. Now it's with her. And now it's considered that she is divorced. That was a delivery. Not a great delivery, not the right way to deliver, but it is technically a delivery. If he was above on the roof and she was below, down on the ground, and he threw it to her, once it has left the space of the roof, meaning once it is out of his domain, even were it to be immediately erased or burnt, hit by lightning, she is divorced. So once it leaves the roof space, it joins the ground space, and that means it's now out of his domain and into hers, and she is divorced. Yes, Natan.
And what happened? There is some wind, and the paper of divorce flew on the air when it still is not under her level. Like it's not in his and it's not in her. What happened in that situation?
Eventually, it's going to have to come down. But if, for example, he threw it and it blew up, back, around, and landed on the roof again, then that is not delivered. It has to get below the level of the roof space. Once it gets below, it doesn't even matter if it touches the ground. It's considered delivered.
But what happens if the wind blow it, 100 feet? Still is divorce?
100 feet, like away and then down?
Yes, away of them.
Once it is gone, it is gone. As long as it gets into her area, because here we are dividing domain not by ownership, but by the occupied space. And in Judaism, like we studied in Eruvin, in Judaism, the airspace above ground, like at rooftop, is considered a different domain than the air down below. That the air down below is lumped together and the air above is separate. So once it gets down into the lower zone, it's out of his domain and it's into hers.
But what happens is when I say that, for example, let's say the paper blow with the wind 30 feet far from her, is farther than the 6 feet of her domain. We are kind of a public domain now. So in this situation, still she's divorced?
Yes, because what's happening here in this section is they are saying, because he is in a different type of domain, the roof domain versus ground domain, all of the ground domain becomes his, all of the roof domain becomes hers, or if their positions are reversed, all the roof is his and all the ground is hers.
Okay.
So they each are occupying different rights. She owns the earth, if you will.
Okay.
As long as it drops below his space, that is considered to be delivered. And Aaron, I thought I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the 4 cubits or 6 feet too, but
Yep.
that answered it.
Got it. Great. And that's just a good reminder. If you ever have questions, ask them, because chances are someone else has the same question. And if they don't have the same question, maybe they will once you bring it up, and then now they're thinking about it differently. All right, so we are still considering delivery, but now we are doing a delivery of a different type of impaired get, what's going to be called an old get. And an old get is an old get is a get that was written for a particular time, but is not going to be delivered until much, much later. So let's get the argument, and then we'll talk about the example. Beit Shammai says a man may divorce his wife with an old get, but Hillel forbids this. What is meant by an old get? One where he was secluded with her after he wrote it. So what they mean is that the get, as we talked about before, should be given in a timely manner. And by timely manner, it means once the get has been written, the husband should not be intimate with her, should not be alone with her at all in the meantime. Why? As we talked about before, because once they're alone together, there is a concern that they reconsummate the relationship, that they have intimacy again. And as in Judaism, there's a general principle, and you may be a little surprised by this in the modern world, that a Jewish man does not engage in intimacy, what's the right word? Not flagrantly, flippantly, that it is not done just for pleasure. It means that it must have been done for the purpose of kiddushin, of marriage. So if they have sex again, even though the get's been written, it must be because he wants to marry her again, and thus you would need a second get. So the worry here is not that they've actually been intimate, but that they've been secluded. And by having been secluded, people are going to look at the get and say, well, wait a minute. This get says that it was written in Rabbi Kolb's example, in November, but it wasn't given to her. She didn't actually get divorced until March. But that means that they'll think that she was divorced back in November, and that the baby she now has must be from some other man that she's not married to. And even though having a baby by a man that you're not married to is not considered a strictly forbidden activity, it's also not considered a great thing. And, communities gossip and say bad things about each other. So Beit Shammai says, not a problem. It's okay. As long as the get is still valid and you didn't get up to hanky-panky, the get's okay. Beit Hillel says, no, people will talk. This is wrong. And the get needs to be rewritten because you were secluded in the time in between. Natan, I see your hand up.
Okay, so what happens if someone write a get, and between the writing and the delivery in the get, they still live in the same house, but in completely different rooms?
So that's what this argument is basically about. According to Beit Shammai, that's okay. According to Beit Hillel, that's not okay. Now, one of the things that would mitigate this a great deal is, then the concern that Beit Hillel has, is whether or not the community knows that there was a separation. Here, it's not obvious. In fact, it seems to be hidden from the community at large that the get was actually written earlier than was given, and that the pregnancy in the meantime came from this husband. So there seems to be some confusion in the community about whether she was up to her licentious ways. So if it was a situation where they got divorced and everybody knew they were divorced, but because they were waiting for one person to move out or selling the house or whatever might be the situation, as long as that was commonly understood and known, and again, as long as they were refraining from intimacy, then it shouldn't be a problem.
For both, for Hillel and Shammai.
Right.
That
I mean, but again,
that you described for both. If the community knows, for both agree, Hillel and Shammai, that's okay.
Right. And remember that in the case that you're describing, where it's the get has been given already, at the beginning of that, like in this case, the example being in November, it's just that the wife hasn't moved out. That's actually a different situation than what we're talking about for the original situation. The original situation was the get didn't even get delivered until very, very late. The get was written in November, but given in March. So he divorced her. He knew he was divorcing her, but he went ahead and kept living with her and, maybe even being with her. And then after a few months, he gave her the document. The situation you're describing, he had the get written. The get was then delivered within the reasonable amount of time. And that means that there has been a full dissolution of the relationship. There isn't this, he knows about the get, she doesn't know about the get gap in between.
But in that situation, okay, like for example, if you, both situations, okay, like if you, one write the get and didn't deliver it, that still they are living during in the same house, different rooms. Or second one, they already delivered the get, but still they are living in the same house, different rooms, because the other person needs to find where to live. Okay, either case. For Hillel and Shammai, it's okay if the whole community knows about the situation, or only for Shammai is okay?
Well, from Shammai's opinion, it's okay no matter what.
Yes.
From Hillel's position, from the argument that I saw in the Talmud of what Hillel's position was about, it would seem that if it was very clear, public knowledge in the community, that the get had been written but not delivered, and that they were not being intimate together, that the community would probably be okay. You'll notice that Rabbi Kolp's example specifically involves a pregnancy that takes place. And that's, part of what is at the core of Beit Hillel's concern, is that there will be a stigma attached to both her and the child if people think that the get was given months and months earlier than it actually was. So if you can remove that doubt, and of course, if you can remove, the intimacy and not get in pregnant situation with somebody you're trying to divorce, then it makes it a much better situation all around. So yes, I think even Beit Hillel would go along with a full disclosure, transparency situation. Aaron, you have in both cases. Yes, in both cases.
Hey, Rabbi, just out of curiosity, does the note say that Beit Shammai's opinion is based on the fact that he thinks you can only divorce your wife for adultery?
So the note that happens here in Rabbi Kolp's commentary here at the bottom of this paragraph is that he is arguing that it could be that Beit Shammai's opinion is that the only reason why this is a position for Beit Shammai is because Beit Shammai believes that divorce only happens when there is adulterous behavior by the wife. Now, I'm not 100% convinced by that personally, but I can understand why he feels that as being a deciding factor. But we'll talk about Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel's opinion about when people get divorced at another time. But spoiler alert, Beit Shammai loses this argument like most, and divorce can happen for any reason, not only for adultery. Yes, Eric.
No, I was gonna say, how could he make that mistake? Because it seems like there's tons of tradition that say, like you, for any reason, including the war example, if I don't come back from war, I'm divorced.
You mean, how could Beit Shammai hold that a get should only be given for adultery if we've spent many different times talking about conditional gets that were given for a war, for long distance travel, for illness and things like that? Well, you're right. I think what Beit Shammai would argue is that there's a difference between a precautionary conditional get and a actual divorce, where the husband is divorcing her because of a ervat davar, because there is something wrong with her. And it's that definition of ervat davar that becomes the centerpiece of their debate. So I think that would be how Beit Shammai explains that if there is a divorce for cause, it must be adultery. If there is a get as a precautionary legal instrument, then it doesn't need a cause. All right, 8.5. We've talked about writing, and now we're going to get down to some nitty-gritty details of what happens if it goes wrong. If the get was dated by an unfit kingdom, by the empire of Media, by the empire of Greece, by the building of the temple or by the destruction of the temple, or actually I'll pause there. So all of these first conditions are talking about the date stamp on your get. That if you say this get was written in the 50th year of Greece, of the Grecian Empire, the get's invalid. Now, it's not because we don't like the Greeks, it's because at the time that the Mishnah was being written, the Greek Empire was not a real empire. It wasn't a real kingdom. As such, it was not considered to be a suitable date for universal understanding. So if you date it by something that you shouldn't use as a date, it's going to be wrong. Or if being in the East, he wrote in the West, or being in the West, he wrote in the East, again, it's wrong. If wrote with just these little errors, which are not major substantial errors, but are errors nonetheless, then hold on to your horses because we're going to get a bit of a list. She must leave this one and that one. And she also requires a get from this one and that one. What it means is that if he gave her a get, saying in the 300th year of the reign of Alexander the Great, who isn't around anymore, then it comes to light that the get was written incorrectly, and in the meantime she had remarried some other guy, then she has to get another get from the first husband and a second get and a first get from the second husband, and she is not allowed to live with the first husband, nor is she allowed to live with the second husband. In fact, she is being treated as though she committed adultery, because the argument here is technically she did. If the get was improperly constructed, then when she remarried, it wasn't a marriage, and that means that she was still married to the first husband, and that means that the second guy was just her lover, which means she is committing adultery. Thus, she has no ketubah, no usufruct, no support money or worn clothes, neither from this one nor from that one. Neither husband has any obligation to her. If she has taken anything from this one or that one, she must return it. The child from this one or that one is a mamzer, meaning even if she went back with the first husband after it was found out and then she had a child from him, that child is also considered a mamzer, even though it was by her first husband in the second case. Neither this one nor that one may impurify himself for her, meaning if they are Kohanim, they are not allowed to treat her as a wife with regards to a funeral, and they are not allowed to render themselves impure to attend to those needs. Neither this one and that one has a claim to whatsoever she may find, nor what she makes with her hands, nor to invalidate her vows. They have no authority over her. If she was the daughter of an Israelite, she becomes disqualified from marrying a priest. If the daughter of a Levite, from eating the tithe, and if the daughter of a priest, from eating truma. She is struck from the lists as far as any of the conditions of being part of those groups. Neither the heirs of this one nor the heirs of that one are entitled to inherit her ketubah. Normally, as we've talked about before, the son of a woman is entitled to inherit her ketubah. so that if she dies before the ketubah is cashed in, he is allowed to collect. Here, no, they do not get to take the ketubah on her behalf. And if the husband dies, the brother of the one and the brother of the other must perform chalitza, yibum, the levirate release, but may not contract yibum. They are considered to be married or connected enough that they need chalitza, but they are not considered properly connected and thus cannot do yibum, the levirate marriage. All right, that's a very, very long list. Aaron, let's start off with your question.
How come she can't eat? How come she can't eat tithes? Because I thought anybody could eat tithes, no matter what their status was, as long as it was given to a Levite first.
So in this particular case, you're talking about the tithes that are given to the Levites, the tithes that are meant to be for them. And as part of the family, she would have the right to those tithes. But here she has, in quotes, blotched her her connection to the family. So yes, as one of the generic mass, the rest of us, she can receive from that, but she can't receive the tithe directly. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
So the female can receive, if the female is a Levite, she can directly receive tithes then?
She is allowed to have the tithes as part of her family position. Yes. She doesn't get the tithes because they were gifted to her by someone else, but they are within her family domain.
All right. I thought wasn't there a tithe that I thought the priest, once they get, could give to anybody they wanted?
I didn't hear the rest of that question. Sorry, it cut off.
Wasn't there a tithe that once the Levites got, they could give them to whoever they wanted?
Yes, but the point is that they are then choosing to give to someone else, not giving within their own family, because that's not giving. That is the family property, if you will. All right, so everyone's okay with this? No one's complaining? No problems? This, I guess I've all trained you to just accept the incredible injustices that can sometimes happen. So let me just first of all explain that this opinion, according to the Talmud, is eventually rejected. This is considered to come from Rabbi Meir. Next Mishnah is considered to be coming from Rabbi Akiva, and they are considered to be non-normative opinions. And she is not put in this position, and the children are not created as mamzers, et cetera, et cetera. So why might Rabbi Meir and then later Rabbi Akiva believe that this is the right position when it's so clearly affecting her so terribly, right? And especially affecting any children who become mamzerim, a status that there is no exit from, that they are stuck like that forever through no fault of their own, and again, through no fault of hers, that the get itself was defective in a trivial detail, not defective in the material components. This isn't like it was a get written for some other woman. This isn't like a get that was written for some other husband. This is a get that was written for her, by her husband, witnessed and delivered correctly, but someone put the wrong date in. Okay. So why might they believe that this would be a problem that deserves this level of difficulty? Is because in general, we are always forced with positions, well, often forced with positions where we have to balance the needs of the community versus the needs of an individual. The community needs the documents to be correct. The community needs there to be a reliable, trustworthy, dependable system for establishing who is married and who's not married. Without that, it's chaos. Without that, there's no way to prevent adultery, no way to prevent all sorts of problems going on in society. We need structure. Judaism has a vested interest in knowing who's getting married and not getting married, knowing that that's being done according to Jewish law. On the other hand, we also have a vested interest in making sure that no individual is stabbed in the back because of a typo. And in general, we try to find a balance. What can we do to protect the individual while also protecting this societal need for the structure? That's why we need a get in the first place. It's why the get in general has to follow all the rules we've talked about. But here we find a division point. Rabbi Meir, and then next Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva, go to the side of any mistake at all, even a non-material one, invalidates the get, and thus the second marriage is adultery, and all of the implications come from that. But the majority of the rabbis, as the Talmuds discuss, don't agree. The non-material error does not invalidate the second marriage to this point. There is a position of they should still get divorced from her second husband, that there is still an issue there, but not all of these other consequences being stacked on top of it. And in the end of the day, that's the position that stands. Yes, Natan.
So she can divorce of the first or the second husband?
Technically from both.
But she can choose which she wants to.
No. She has to get divorced from both of them.
The first one was the get that they did a mistake in the typing mistake. Right. And the second one, why she needs to divorce from the second one for the type of the mistake?
Because her marriage to the second one was not 100% free and clear. There was still a shadow of a doubt.
So that's my problem. Like that's what I see. That the problem is like, why you want to punish her for a mistake that someone else did? And that's what bothered me. Like if it was something that she acted incorrectly, she did some fault action or fault decision, or as you say, the process wasn't very clean because her mistake. I understand. Okay, she needs to divorce. There's consequences, punishment, whatever. But in this case, like first of all, she's not an Talmid Chacham because they didn't study Talmud. She doesn't have any way to know all these details of the law, Jewish law, because she didn't study. Okay, and also because someone else did that mistake when she acted in good faith, thinking that doing everything correctly. Why is she punished at all? Like I think that personally, if I was the rabbi, and I'm not the rabbi at the time of the Mishnah, I don't think that she needs to divorce the second husband. And then should accept the first get. Maybe I'm too lenient, too soft, but because that's my perspective, okay, that I can see who did the mistake and they are working in good faith or not acting good faith. And that's my perspective.
No, and you're not alone in that. There are voices in the tradition that agree with you that in a case like this, where she did nothing wrong at all, there's no reason why not only her, but or the children or anybody would be, or the second husband would have to deal with any of this if the mistake was a non-material mistake. The issue then
good faith mistake, like from their perspective.
Right, but there's a couple of issues then we still need to discuss. One is, what about mistakes that are not like non-material? What about they got her name wrong, right? They called her Sarah, but her name is Rivka. Does that mean, she can't read, let's imagine? So she didn't notice in the get that it had the wrong name, but then it was found out later that the get had the wrong name in it. Does that mean that there's no problem? Does that mean she was doing nothing wrong? Right? We would be more uncomfortable at that point. And if we're not uncomfortable at that point, then why have a get at all? Right? Why have a system of divorce if in no circumstance are we going to say that divorce wasn't done correctly? And that comes back to my earlier introduction, which is in Judaism, we believe that the community has an interest in the private life of individuals. Now, I know that's not a popular sentence in the modern world, and I know that it's often abused in the modern world, that many people will take an overactive interest in the private life of individuals, that many people will claim that they are just acting for the good of society, when in fact they are merely trying to dominate or persecute people they don't like. And we need to be very careful that those types of people do not monopolize the language of community and the language of society. Everyone, wherever you are in the political spectrum, should recognize that we do have a need for community, that we do have a need for some society, some connection between people that is more than just the random atomization of individuals floating through the ether of the 21st century. The question becomes, at what point does the community interest in making sure that all divorces are done correctly become an overbearing burden for a minor issue? And that's why this is such a contentious issue, and why eventually the Talmud says this Mishnah is not put into halacha, that this was an opinion of Rabbi Meir, but it is not the opinion of the Chachamim, and it doesn't move its way in the halacha. But it is still very delicate to navigate all of the other possible mistakes to try and avoid this, which, as I mentioned long ago, but it bears repeating here especially, this is one reason why both Rabbeinu Gershom put a takana of cherem, of excommunication, on anybody who would say negative things about a get. And it is why the get now is not examined after the delivery at all, right? It is signed, delivered, and sealed, right? Not signed, sealed, and delivered. It is signed, delivered, and sealed, and put away and never examined again, for precisely the reason that we not open up this particular can of worms, which, for my money, is the most insightful solution that our ancestors have come up with.
Which one? Sorry, I didn't hear. Which one of Rabbi Gershon? Which solution?
The idea that once the get has been delivered, nobody is allowed to say anything negative about it. Mm-hmm. Because if you do, you go under cherem, you're into like excommunication, which is different in Judaism than Catholicism, but that's another class. So the best solution is to not go looking for these problems. To ensure the get is done right, you examine it before it's delivered. But once it's delivered, you don't go back and proofread it a second, third, fourth, fifth time 5 years later. Once it is delivered, it's done. All your quality control checks happen before delivery, not after. Because after, you have the potential for this kind of mess, or at least this argument for this option. And we don't want to live in a world where this is the outcome. We want a world where a divorce is arranged and executed correctly, and then done, for exactly these reasons. Aaron, you have your hand up.
Yes, Rabbi. So on the first example you gave, when you said the Talmud reached a different conclusion, but you still have to get divorced, it looked like it was a compromise, is what you were saying, where they're divorcing everyone, but the bad things that happen to the kid and losing the property doesn't happen. Is that
correct? That is the opinion.
But if the first gets invalid, wouldn't all that other stuff apply? Or
well, there's not a question. At that point, it becomes a rabbinic enactment rather than a deoraita, a Torah level requirement. So, right. So the rabbis are saying, as a gezerah, as a precautionary measure, we're going to remove all the relationships. But since it is being removed at a rabbinic level, because of our concern for the community, it is not triggering the Torah level implications.
But I still don't get how they can remove the relationships at a rabbinic level, don't you? Because it's Torah law that you're applying. So you're using rabbinic law to remove Torah law or create a leniency?
No. So I'll try one more explanation, but then we should probably move on unless we want to turn this into a Talmud class. The basic idea would be that according to the Torah, they are actually divorced, that the small error in date doesn't count. And the first divorce was good enough for the Torah. But because there was this aspersion, the stigma attached, the gossip that grows up because people say, well, the get was invalid, the get was damaged, the get wasn't right, it was, ta'ut. They implement a stringency to try and quash that, to stop that. Now, whether or not that's the best opinion, whether or not that's the one that we should take forward, that's a great question. And that's where we get into more practical discussions of how we apply this in the centuries that follow. But that's the underlying thinking. And where the rabbis have created a stringency, the rabbis can make their own leniencies for themselves. No, they can't invent leniencies against the Torah, but they can absolutely create leniencies against themselves, against their own stringency. Indeed, that's much of how the whole section of Eruvin works. That much of Eruvin was created by rabbinic dictate as a stringency, and thus when the rabbis create leniencies for carrying, they are creating leniencies against themselves, not against the Torah.
But Rabbi, so in the first opinion, the kids are becoming mamzers under rabbinic law, which that didn't make sense to me either, because then they couldn't marry mamzers, because on Torah law they're not mamzers, but then they couldn't marry non-mamzers because under
in the first opinion, they are mamzerim under Torah law. The opinion that's here in the Mishnah, right? The what we call the Tanakama, the initial opinion in the Mishnah is the Torah says they weren't divorced. Therefore, the second husband is definitely adultery. Therefore, the children are, according to Torah, mamzerim. So that opinion is what's being rejected. Last part of Mishnah 5. If his name or her name or the name of his town or the name of her town was wrongly given, she must leave both husbands, and all of the above consequences apply to her. So again, they're saying that there are other types of problems, and those could also trigger the same results. And just looking at the time, I want to do a quick run through because we're going to get a bunch of similar issues. So let's try and bundle them together. With regard to all of the near relatives concerning whom they said their rivals are permitted to marry without chalitza, if the rival wives went and married and it was found that this one, the near relative, was an ilonit, meaning was infertile, the rival wife who married must leave both husbands, and all of these consequences apply. So as we talked about when we did Yevamot, if the woman who gets married is married because the other wife was the one who had done the proper ceremony, either yibum or chalitza. If it is found that that woman was not eligible to do the ceremony in the first place because she was an ilonit, that she was infertile, a technical term in Judaism, different than modern infertility, then that means that the initial dissolution of the levirate marriage was invalid, and thus all of the other marriages would also be invalid because they would still be bound to the brother of the deceased husband. So that's the situation here where, again, Rabbi Akiva is saying all of these consequences, the whole long list up above, would apply. And yeah, I can see from your face, Natan, you're saying, what the, how incredibly
apply, or will apply or will not apply? What's the Rabbi Akiva?
Rabbi Akiva says it would apply.
You know what? For technically, they destroy the life of a lot of families and also people. That's what bothers me.
Right. So again, what according to Rabbi Akiva and his opinion, if if the initial marriage is found out to have been if the initial divorce, or in this case, chalitza or yibum, was found out to be an error, then everything that happened afterward is also an error. And if it was an error with relationships, then all of these consequences of mamzerim as being the worst and all the other ones would apply.
Yeah, because maybe they had also somewhat children during that time that they discovered that she's not fertile. And you made the kids, okay, mamzer for nothing. So you destroy the life of people for a mistake like that, and good faith mistake, like not that they do the kavanah. So I have really a lot of issues with that. Is there any rabbi there from that generation that thinks like me?
Well, it's not a question of, I mean, every rabbi has compassion, right? All of the rabbis care about the individuals and care about the community. It's the rabbis are trying to figure out, how do we navigate these very rare, very difficult circumstances? Now, they're not going to make a decision just about what makes them sleep better at night. They're not going to make a decision about how can we avoid hurting the most people, because we're not a utilitarian religion, right? We're not counting the benthams of the greatest good for the greatest number and the least harm for the most people. It's, well, what does the Torah say we should do? Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, what the Torah says we should do is, if it was a mistake, it was a mistake, and everything after is also a mistake. According to the other rabbis, it was, if it was okay at the time, even if it looks like it was a mistake later, we take the ruling from the time that it happened, and that's good enough for the future. Both of those are reasonable positions, and neither of those are worried consciously about the number of people that are going to be good or bad. And that's the tricky thing about law. As somebody who studied politics, I know you are aware that oftentimes laws can have unintended consequences. And that doesn't mean the law itself is even necessarily a bad law. Sometimes the law will end up pinching someone in ways that you would rather it wouldn't. Now, here, like I said, Rabbi Akiva isn't happy about this being the consequence. He just thinks it's inevitable. And the other rabbis disagree. And so, like I said, the halakha does not follow this Mishnah. The halakha says that, no, if it was okay at the time they got married, then that's where we rule regarding the children, what their status is.
Also go against Rabbi Akiva.
It goes against Rabbi Akiva.
Okay. Because in Tuvot, you say that Judaism is not a utilitarian religion. It's about law. But when I'm studying now with Yomi Ketubot, you can see that many of the stuff is very utilitarian. It's how to be flexible and damage as less as possible, and use common sense to allow people to move on in their life. The same with all the Masechot that we study. Most of the time, we are not labeled utilitarianism. However, the philosophy that I see from the rabbi is, how can I make people the life easier, so Judaism will be an joy and not an burden.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that is, I'm glad that you've noticed that is the tendency throughout Judaism. But it's done in a very not self-conscious kind of way. The rabbis are never going to say, well, that can't be the law because that seems mean. The rabbis are going to say, that doesn't seem to be the right interpretation. Now, it happens that 9 times out of 10, in almost every circumstance, the interpretation the rabbis of the Talmud are going to go for is not mean, at least certainly by the standard of their days, but even by the standard of our days in many, many situations. And that is impressive. But for not stating it as being a primary goal, they certainly end up there very, very often. And that's not coincidental. It's because the rabbis are interpreting the Torah with the Torah. That's a fundamental principle of Judaism. And the Torah in itself talks about compassion and justice and kindness over and over again. The Torah doesn't usually hold up as an example the rigid person who allows the law to abuse other people. Yiftach, the idiot who made an oath that ended up damning his daughter to be sacrificed, is not held up as being a good guy or a good leader.
No.
That's an example of a really bad thing. We don't work slavishly to the law. We work for compassion and kindness. That doesn't mean we overrule the law with compassion and kindness, but it does mean that we will often lean in a particular direction. All right, the last Mishnah here is the same theme. If a man marries a sister-in-law and her rival wife goes and marries another man, and it was found that the first is an Ilonit, thus invalidating the original, the other must leave both husbands, and all these consequences apply. Again, the halakha does not follow this, but we are, as always, preserving even minority opinions. All right, and we're going to leave our study there because it's 8 o'clock. We'll pick up with 8.8, which is going back into the details of writing the get and its delivery. All right. Thank you guys for a great and stimulating discussion. I hope to see everybody again next week. And in the meantime, keep studying this and everything else.
Thank you for the shiur.
Baruch Tiyeh.